Thanks, John. So my name is Liz MacPherson. I'm the government statistician. I'm also the government's Chief Data Steward. It's a new title, something I'll explain as I'm talking to you. It's wonderful to be here. I was just saying that I'd been watching the weather. Yesterday I would have got 31 degrees, 32 degrees. Today I think it's going to be a maximum of 16. It was 7 when I landed this morning from Wellington. We got the 120k winds too. It's just we're used to it. Right, so those of you who are observant will notice that the title for my talk changed. I took a speaker's prerogative and decided that I would focus on the connection between open source, a passion of mine, which is open data. And I've linked in there open minds as well, because I think we have to have, if we're going to work in this space, we have to have an open mind, and that's what the open source community is all about. I am absolutely passionate about the power of data, and at Stats New Zealand we're committed to unleashing the power of data to change lives, and we see that that's best done by putting data and that power in the hands of decision makers at all levels: government, local government, families, students, communities. And so as the government statistician, I'm responsible for official statistics, and in particular for the way in which we produce statistics. I authorise all the statistics that we produce and the data that we publish. In my new role as Government Chief Data Steward, my focus is on building a foundation, an ecosystem, a trusted ecosystem where we can truly get the full potential out of government data. And that's about better managing it. It's about better managing access to it. It's about the way that we use it, but it's also fundamentally about building trust in that data, in the way that it's used. And again, you'll find me coming back over and over again to the theme that openness, open source, open data, open minds, is how we build trust. But of course there are some tensions in there, and we need to think those ones through, because there are those for whom that very openness can bring some challenges. So we'll need to think about that. Now, a really big shout out to the Linux community. One of the reasons I'm here is because I am so supportive of the focus on openness, on the open community, on what goes with being open source, which is that willingness to share, the willingness to test, the willingness to open up your ideas to others in the belief that it's going to make things stronger and better. And thinking about communities, I just wanted to, in this room, I'm assuming that everybody in this room has got at least 3 devices on them. Right. I've got 3. I figured out this morning. I said I was going to say I had 2, but I've actually got a Fitbit. So, and what I want you to do is however you are accessing the internet, Google or otherwise OpenX-ecosystem. And what this will bring up, and some of you are already familiar with this, will bring up something that Amy Whitcroft, who works with me, I'm proud to say, has developed. It's open source, and it's basically a celebration of people, programs, communities working in the OpenX space. It basically turns a Creative Commons license spreadsheet and network graph into a network graph which can be analysed any way you like. You can add to it with a simple form. If you add your details in, you will find that very soon you will be one of these dots. And it's a way of basically mapping the community and for you to see who else is working in this space. The different coloured dots represent people, organisations, programs, initiatives. And so I'd encourage you to add yourself in there. Because this is what it's all about. It's about us working together as a community, knowing who else is working in the space and linking in together. I would say that I did have this enabled, but every time I pulled it up, it tried to crash my system. However, it runs on my phone. So there you go. So you deal in open source. We have a really strong focus on open data. And I'm probably preaching to the converted in this room, but as you probably know, open data is data that anyone can freely access, use and share. It's got an open license, it's openly accessible, and it's both human readable and machine readable. Open government data is open data that's non-personal, unclassified, non-confidential, government-held data. And I am firmly of the view that such data is an incredibly valuable asset that, when safely made open, can multiply in value in New Zealand many times over. It can inform evidence-based policy, it can inform service design, delivery, it can lead to innovative solutions, it can be put in the hands of communities to develop their own service-based designs, to work with government. I believe it is critically important to us being an innovative nation. So open government data is a fundamental enabler of open and transparent government as well. And you've heard that several times from our Prime Minister, the importance of open and transparent government, and my view is that open data is a critical part of that. But all of you in this room would also know that data, open or otherwise, needs context. It's not a silver bullet. It needs to be a servant, not a master. And so it doesn't always reflect the needs or the lived experience of an individual. It can be incomplete, it can be inaccurate, it's not always accessible. The genesis of it is important. We need to understand where it came from. We need to understand the context in which it was developed, because it could inherently have bias associated with it, just simply because of the way it was created. So we really need to focus on those things, and decisions shouldn't be based on data alone. They should be data informed. Interpretation and judgment are vital. And I know that there's a talk a little bit later on by Martin Kraft where he's talking about AI and robots and what have you. And yes, the importance of human judgment in all of these things. So for me, data is an incredibly important resource. It is renewable. So people often talk about data as being like oil. I actually think it's different from oil. It's renewable. But it's only sustainable if we actually maintain trust and confidence. It's one of my messages. Last year, the government reinforced our commitment in New Zealand to open data by adopting the Open Data Charter. It's a really strong signal that the government is committed to open data. And we've basically committed to a set of international principles, which have been adopted by about 64 other national and local governments, including our D9 partners, the UK, South Korea and Uruguay. And some of the principles that sit in behind this say things like open data to be open by default, it should be timely and comprehensive, accessible and usable, comparable and interoperable. It should be used for improving governance and citizen engagement, and for inclusive development and innovation. Now, all of you know that this is we've got a way to go here. So we need to challenge ourselves, and that's the reason for the Charter. We need to keep challenging ourselves to get better in this space. And I know that for my own agency. So we can't ever rest on our laurels. We need to keep moving. And these, if we embed these Charter principles into the way that the state sector works, it will actually help us achieve a world where government information is used to empower people to build the sort of nation that we want to be part of. And I see it as part of my data leadership role to help and to join up with the community of people who are out there who want to achieve the same thing, to take us in that direction. So we're seeing some developments. Talked about the Open Data Charter. In terms of data.gov.nz, StatsNZ and DIA are collaborating to transform this particular tool from a data repository to be the all-of-government starting place for New Zealand's data know-how and data sets. And we're expanding that at the moment. In fact, if you go there now, you'll find that there's a new look and feel. There is an open source pattern library there now. And content strategy and style guide, it's went live this month. So we're really pleased to see that being pushed along. And we ask you as the community members, keep pushing us on this. You know, we want to get better and better. There is also the Open Data Action Plan, and we have been developing that over the last while. The work of the program is outlined in the plan, which you can find on the Stats NZ website. And the sorts of things that we're looking there are things that are designed to accelerate the release and reuse of open government data. And my aim is that we find ourselves in a situation where we're higher than number 7 on the open data parameter. And we currently share that with Japan. As you know, in New Zealand, we've actually, on several other different types of dashboards, we're number one in the world as a place to start business. I'd love to see us up there in terms of open data as well. Those of you who've heard me talk before have said that, we've had this, NZTE often talk about the New Zealand story, which is about open places, open hearts and open minds. I'd like to add open data to that. Right. But as I said, one of the things we have to focus on is ensuring that we maintain trust. If we want people to share their data with us and allow for their data to be reused, then we need to not only think about issues associated with privacy and the safety, technical safety of the data, we also need to be thinking about broader ethical issues. Now, at Stats New Zealand, we take put a lot of effort into ensuring that data is safe. We are very much of the view that people entrust us with their data, and that we've got a special role. People give us identifiable data. We are given that both in terms of surveys, but also from administrative data across government, and then we use that and we turn it into data which can then, as you can see through this process on the screen, from identifiable data into de-identified data that can be used in a safe place in a lab, through to confidentialised data. And it's that data that we open up. Now, we know even there that if somebody wanted to go really hard at it, they could try and open up that confidentialised data. We try and make it as hard as possible for people not to do that, but part of the issue with being the community that we want to be in New Zealand is we want to actually make it such that people don't seek to do that. So some of the things that we'll be thinking about there in conjunction with the Privacy Commissioner and others, and people like the Ministry of Justice, is what is some of the hard letter law and what is some of the soft regulation that's necessary to actually enable us to be the sort of country that can use more and more data. And for people to trust that their data will actually be safe. And one of the issues there is making it an offence potentially to re-identify. Whereas at the moment, actually, the offence sits on with the person who's put the data out there in a confidentialised fashion. The penalty sits with them. So one of the key questions for us here is around, as I said, ethics. We have legislation that allows us to reuse data. But the question is, when we look at data and new and different types of ways of using that data, the question we should be asking ourselves is, we can, but should we? We need to be constantly having that sort of question at the back of our minds. And again, coming back to the open source community, one of the things that is that I believe can help us in this space is greater transparency. So when we are doing new and different things with data, are we being open about what we're doing? And also, are we making things like our code, our data sets open, and using the community to help us with assurance? So I'm going to come back to that in a couple of minutes. At the same time as we're talking about how positive open data can be, we also need to think about and acknowledge that all too often there are important voices that are not heard when we use data to make decisions. And if we truly believe that the power of data should be used to provide insights that can change lives, it needs to be not just the domain of government or business, that power needs to be put in the hands of users. Now, too often we find that conversations are about the use of data without actually talking to the people who, in research parlance, are the population of interest. Is that population of interest actually getting any benefits from the use of this data? Do they understand how it's being used, and are they empowered to use their own data? Now, one of the really critical conversations that I'm delighted is starting to happen across New Zealand at the moment is around Māori data sovereignty and around how are we thinking about treaty principles and how we're working together around data. And at Stats New Zealand, we are very committed to partnering with Māori to form a robust and enduring relationship in terms of how that data is used and thinking about what this means from a Te Ao Māori perspective. And one of the things we have done is convened some panel sessions earlier this year to explore this issue in more detail. And this is just a 30-second trailer for some of these conversations. I'd really encourage you to go on our website and have a look at them. Hopefully this works.
It's essential that governments have not only data but the use of data and the free availability of that data, not only for government but also for the public. Because that's how we should make policy based on, it should be evidence-based. How many houses are we, how much money we have to spend on all those sorts of issues, transport. So, and that should be a two-way thing. It shouldn't be protected and for only government. It should be for you.
So an important conversation going on at the moment within Te Ao Māori and across the state sector about Māori data, is data a taonga? These are conversations that are happening at the community level. And one of the things we're trying to facilitate at the moment is for a true partnership discussion where with Te Ao Māori around how do we get the best out of Māori data? What is Māori data? How do we best steward that data, and doing that in partnership? Now, I do know, because I've been at conversations where when you're thinking about things from this perspective, there are real conversations about how open data fits. These are important conversations to have. These are not things to be shied away from. These are conversations that we need to have. And I believe that we can be a richer nation for having them. One of the things that I didn't talk about earlier was the fact that across government at the moment, one of the things that we're doing is that we have open data, but there's some data that simply can't be shared. There you go. There is some data that that sits in that de-identified space. So this is where we need to we bring data together, because as those of you who are in this room know, the magic happens where you actually get the integration between data sets. And as in most parts of life, the magic happens where you actually get integration, you get the collision of ideas. So one of the things we do at Stats is that we bring together government data and we integrate it into something called in this particular case, the integrated data infrastructure, which has data from across the whole of government. It's brought in an individualised form. It's linked And then it's the identifying characteristics of name, date of birth and day of birth and address are taken out. Now, we only make that data available currently within a data lab environment. And yes, there is a physical data lab, but we make this available through remote data labs, and many people will have come across them and used them. For us there, the ongoing challenge is how do we make this data, which is so powerful, more and more available? How do we, is it possible for us to actually confidentialise to a point where we could actually let people get access to this data, not necessarily within the data lab environment that we currently have, but using the strength of the ideas that come from people like the open source communities that you're part of to actually find new and different ways of doing this. One of the things we're doing at the moment is we've been developing a tool that confidentialises on the fly. So we're testing that at the moment. And these are the sorts of tools that we hope will actually be able to make more available across the government and to researchers and others outside. The other thing what this particular type of data, of course, provides the ability to do is to look at the impact of life experience on life outcome. So since we've had this sort of data, you will have seen that there are more and more government agencies who are using it to develop tools for looking at what they think outcomes might look like. And one of the things that we looked at recently across government, working with the GCDO at DIA, was the government's current use of algorithms. And the reason we want to do this, of course, is because we want to ensure that we're maintaining trust and confidence. And we understand fully that when you're using data, as I said earlier, all data has a context, and that data can actually have some bias associated with it. Now, we know we as humans do. It goes without saying that the data that has been created by humans will also have some bias associated with it, and it'll be the product of the policy settings that were around at the time. So one of the things we did was we looked at 14 government social sector agencies and looked at their current use of algorithms. One of the things that we weren't surprised to discover was that these agencies that they are using algorithms, but they're pretty unsophisticated ones at the moment. There is currently no use of AI across these agencies. I would describe most of the algorithms that are being used as automated decision-making tools, as opposed to anything much more sophisticated than that. There are a few that are using the sort of data that we make available for risk profiling. But when it comes to making decisions about outcomes for individuals, what we found is that essentially in the main, if a decision is about saying no to access to an entitlement or something like that, a human is brought into the chain. Where a decision is a yes decision, then they're more likely to be automated. Now, what that says to me is a number of things, and we had some recommendations about the way in which we went about improving the use of algorithms across government. One of them, so there's a number of them, there's involving the communities of interest in the actual development of the algorithms in the first place, making it transparent that you're using algorithms. We also said, and this is where this community comes in, that we should be looking at making code available data sets available and moving in that direction, because that improves our assurance. And in particular, as we head towards the use of deeper machine learning techniques in AI, and that will come, we need to actually be building in our approaches right now. And what this particular stocktake said to me was, we're early enough in the process to actually put in place some principles that allow us to really get some benefits. Yeah. Yeah. So in this particular case, as I said, the algorithms that are being used are usually developed. Yeah, yeah. So in this particular case, the bulk of them are pretty basic and they've been developed here. But you make a very good point, which is, algorithms are a product of the person or persons who designed them, in the same way as the data is also a product of the context. So from that perspective, we actually have to be thinking about both the design of the algorithm, and we also have to be thinking about the data that's being used to train it. And I believe that we're in a situation in New Zealand where we are early enough that we can actually have good conversations about this. One of the things that I am aware of, though, is that things are moving so fast that designing legislation to try and keep up is a big ask. You can do some of that, and have principle-based legislation, but having soft forms of regulation, and in particular bodies that you can effectively get advice from, is going to be critically important. And one of the things that came out of the work that we did, it's just a small snapshot of those 14 social sector agencies, was the recommendation that we establish a data ethics advisory panel. An independent one, the idea being that group could actually help government agencies with these new and novel ideas, testing boundaries, having those sorts of conversations. So from that perspective, we'll be calling for expressions of interest over the next month or so in that space. As I said, one of the things that can help us in terms of transparency is opening things up for you in this community and others to test it. Here's a big shout out to our Creative Commons people in government and NZ Goal. And in the case of NZ Goal, as you are probably aware, being the New Zealand Government's open access and licensing framework, it's recently been, relatively recently been extended to software. And we were having a bit of this conversation earlier with respect to procuring other forms of assistance in this space. But the government in New Zealand has been, with respect to software, a little slow to adopt open source software. For a long time, it basically, rightly or wrongly, had been seen as a risk. And those people in this room who did help it along, thank you. So a classic fear of the unknown, I think, and also the sort of conversation that we were having prior to this talk starting, which is government agencies tend to be held to account for the way in which they spend their money, obviously, and rightly or wrongly, the focus had been on having, larger companies who supposedly would then stand behind their products, and that would provide you with your belts and braces, etc. So things are beginning. But things are beginning to change. And thanks in part to the publishing of the NZ Goal software extension and good work from people in this room and many other agencies. And a shout out to my colleagues at Creative Commons. So, as you know, it's got guidance about how to apply open source licenses to publicly funded software development, and that guidance is now being used across government. So, an example, within my own organisation, for example, we've we've been releasing some of our code for small area estimation as open source. The Social Investment Agency used the guidance to release code they developed as open source. Their social investment analytic layer, which takes microdata from our integrated database that I was talking about earlier, and processes into a form that is basically more easily accessible to researchers. So that particular code took a team of 6 data scientists 6 weeks to develop, and they've now released that as open source, and so people don't have to reinvent the wheel. I am a huge champion of this. I want to see more and more of it. At StatsNZ, again, looking to use more open source. It does take a bit where you've got legacy situations to, where your organisation has always used a particular type of approach to move along from those things. But I think we are increasingly finding new and different ways of doing things. And on a related note, with respect to the use of AI, we're collaborating with the AI Forum on how we support ethical and transparent use of data. As I said, and preaching to the converted in this community, opening things up, making them more transparent, allowing people like yourselves to actually test is a way that we can get greater assurance. One of the things that we've been teasing through in conjunction with the AI Forum and talking to our colleagues across government is how do you audit an algorithm? How do you assure that how do you assure the auditors? How do you think about this? And it seems to me that a starting point is to think about how we open things up, how we make things more transparent. Right, so we need to continue to make the community strong, and a shout out to the open data meetups. John is the head of that here in Christchurch. And there are many other ways that we can actually build the communities and have these important conversations. As I said, my view is that for too long we've actually shied away from them. So we need to be having the conversations about, what does consent really mean? What does implied consent mean? How do we actually deal with this if we want to really reuse data? As I said, we have legal frameworks for doing that at the moment, but are we having the right conversations? And that comes back to us here at Stats as well. So last year we ran a data summit where, for those of you who know her book, we had Kathy, Weapons of Math Destruction, speaking. We also focused on Maori data sovereignty and had Professor Tahu Kukatai speaking. And the idea is those conversations need to keep building. And I'm just going to finish up now with one of my favourite, all-time favourite, all-time favourite uses of open data, creations of open data, being the Cacophony project and this incredible visualisation of birdsong. These are birds flying out of Karori Wildlife Sanctuary. And each different coloured dot represents a different species of bird. So we have kakariki, we have te eke, the saddleback. And it is a truly wonderful thing to behold. And this is how we can, as communities, safeguard our planet, the species that matter to us, and really do things that can benefit the whole of New Zealand, and it's beautiful. It does work, it just takes a while. Yeah, so they turn this bird song into data. Which I think is extraordinary. And in a moment, they basically stop and turn it around to show you the dots that are the te eke, etc. But this is truly magical, turning something which is the communication of birds into data, and then using that data to allow us to understand their movements and how we can then preserve them for the future. So I'm going to end on that note. So thank you for listening, and thank you for being part of the community. We have a lot we need to achieve together.
Thank you for coming and for being part of the community as well. A little reflection about consent and trust and how you can acquire data. Background, I'm originally from Uruguay as well as from Oamaru, as you recognize by the accent. And I cannot avoid, I'm really aware of the Digital Nine. I know Jose Klastornik, we worked together 20 years ago. How Uruguay is a leader in terms of data acquisition. It has a lot of dark reasons on that, involuntarily. So 50 years ago, I already had my identity card. Identity cards in Uruguay are something that New Zealanders has no clue. If I have a baby after he is 45 days old, I have an identity card. This is something which is already standard. In the same way that in Uruguay you have a single telecom operator. You don't have options. In the same way that there are good things happening, like one laptop per child program. But what I'm saying is there is a strong state behind that. Democratic or dictatorship. My parallel with New Zealand is that I come here and suddenly I have a strong state imposing me to use Microsoft, for example. So I cannot avoid draw those parallelisms. So my child goes to Waitaki Boys High, and I receive an email from the principal saying, "You are welcome to use Office 365. It's free. I have right here, there is no free lunch." Now, how can you go against these things? You are very generous with the comment saying that the state is slow in adoption and change. There is never fast enough. So that's an observation. Thank you.
Right. I think there's probably a few other people who have similar comments to make. So maybe we'll take a collection.
So thank you very much, Liz. I'm very impressed by the degree of conscientious thinking that's going into the use of personal private data and the risk associated with it. However, I also notice that we don't tend to talk very much about the vast amount of data that isn't private, which needs to be made open. The one that I'm most interested in is the one that's actually most private now, and that is commercial data that's being deemed to be commercially sensitive. I'm wondering if you have anything, if you could say anything about the plans to increase access to what is considered commercially sensitive data, especially things like the government expenditure on proprietary tools.
Okay, any more tricky questions anyone wants to load up? There's another one up there. And then I'll try and pick them off as I go.
Thank you. That was really interesting. You mentioned the bias in government, in some of the government data. I was just wondering if you could give some examples of the bias that you've seen.
Okay. Yeah.
I just want to come back to a comment you made earlier about the change you're considering about making de-anonymizing data a crime, and your thoughts on the perverse incentives that actually creates in regards to the responsibility of taking care of the data properly in the first place. In the same way in the security aspects of technology, where it's a crime to, in a lot of places, tell companies that they've got security issues with their software. The incentives are the wrong way around.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so, in no particular order. Well, maybe I'll go with a recency bias, so I'll start at the end. In terms of making, so there has been thought given to the idea of making re-identifying an offence. And it has been done in other jurisdictions. But you're quite right, you actually need to think about what are the potential flow-on effects of doing this. And for example, in Australia they were moving to do this, and they moved to do it quite quickly, and then realised that they'd made it an offence for the very people who are actually, for whom it is their business to actually test people's systems to see whether they can actually, things can be re-identified. It was now an offence for them to do their job. So we have to, in any, my background prior to coming to Stats New Zealand was I've worked in policy and operations across government and policy in a variety of different settings. And when you're changing policy, and the reason why you change a policy is to change behaviour. Otherwise, either to reinforce positive behaviour or to change negative behaviour. So in those situations, you always have to think, what incentives am I setting up here? What are going to be the perverse things that might come out of this? So I do think that before we take that next step, we need to test that one hard. Make sure that there's nothing that's going to flow out of this that's actually going to make us regret having taken this step. And that's certainly one that we can learn from the Australians. In terms of bias in government data, I mean, I'd actually take a step back from that and say, one of the reasons why we do what we do at Stats is because all data is biased in some way, shape or form. You need to understand the nature of it. So, for example, if you're using data that comes from a particular government departments, and you had, at one stage, you had a policy setting that said that if you had these characteristics, you had access to this entitlement. But if you didn't have those characteristics, you didn't have access to that entitlement. Wouldn't surprise you to find that there are lots of people in the data set with the former characteristics and not so many people in the data set with the latter characteristics. So in any way that you're looking at the data, you're using data, you need to be aware of the fact that your policy settings could have an impact. And then you have to be thinking through whether you could actually have a situation where the very policies that you've got in place might be reinforcing some bias in the data. So my point is, you don't ever take any data set as being perfect. It never is. You actually have to interrogate and ask questions about any data set. Moving here. I've only got a minute left to go, apparently. Your question was around your commercial data. Yeah, so you're quite right. And as well as having an integrated data infrastructure, which is a person-centred. We also have one called the Longitudinal Business Database, which is business-centred. But you're right, there are rules, and many of them are actually not statistical in nature at all. They're tax-related, for example, that say that we can't give access to certain levels of data. We're working with our ID on government data. So that's an area where I would, when you're talking about open government data, something I would like to work with my colleagues on is opening up more and more of that, the data about government spend. All I can say is watch the space. Yeah? Yeah. Okay, and then getting back to your point, in terms of, again, it comes to this, back to this point about, and we've taken a step now with respect to software. We now need to take a further step, and this is something that the Government Chief Digital Officer, working with procurement people in MB, will need to be thinking through, which is how do we actually think about the opening up and using different types of different brands. As you said, no one ever got fired for using X, but again, it comes back to how do we build our confidence and capability in using different forms of technology. And I believe we will get there too, but we need to get there faster.
For the Australians in the room, taonga is a Maori word meaning treasure, with an overloaded meaning of socially and culturally a treasure. I think we can agree that data is a treasure, and here is a small taonga as appreciation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.